The rain had stopped, but Charles Rees could still feel the dampness clinging to his jacket as he walked beside Stephen Mendoza through the quiet streets of their neighborhood. What had started as Stephen's desperate plea for a walk to clear his head had turned into something else entirely. They had been walking for nearly an hour now, and Stephen hadn't moved more than 6 inches away from his side the entire time. Their shoulders brushed with every step, a constant reminder of the tension that had been building between them for months. The familiar weight of Stephen's presence beside him was both comforting and electrifying. Charles could smell Stephen's cologne, that subtle woody scent that had become synonymous with home and safety, and all the feelings he'd been trying to suppress for what felt like forever. Every time their arms accidentally touched, Charles felt a jolt of awareness that traveled from the point of contact straight to his heart, reminding him of all the reasons why this walk felt different from their usual evening strolls. Charles stole a glance at Stephen's profile, illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. His jaw was set in that familiar way that meant he was wrestling with something important, something that scared him. The same expression he had worn 3 hours earlier when he had shown up at Charles's apartment, soaked from the rain and looking like his world had just shifted on its axis. Stephen's dark hair was still slightly damp from the earlier downpour, curling at the ends in a way that made Charles want to reach out and smooth it down. But he kept his hands firmly in his pockets, maintaining the careful distance that had become second nature over the past few months of navigating these complicated feelings. "I need to walk," Stephen had said then, his voice barely above a whisper, standing in Charles's doorway like a lost soul seeking sanctuary. The vulnerability in Stephen's voice had cut through Charles like a knife. He'd never been able to refuse Stephen anything. But this request had felt different, weighted with an urgency that made Charles's chest tight with anticipation and fear. Something had happened, something that had shaken Stephen to his core, and Charles had known without asking that whatever it was would change everything between them. Now, as they turned onto the tree-lined path that wound through the small park near their apartments, Charles wondered if Stephen had found whatever clarity he was searching for. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with an electricity that made Charles's skin feel too tight for his body. Every accidental brush of their hands sent sparks shooting up his arm, and he found himself both craving and dreading the next moment of contact. The park was nearly empty at this hour, just a few late-night joggers and dog walkers sharing the winding paths with them. The rain had left everything smelling fresh and clean, the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers creating an almost romantic atmosphere that made Charles hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every step they took together. "Charles," Stephen said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet night air. He stopped walking, and Charles automatically stopped beside him. They were standing under a lamppost, bathed in golden light that made Stephen's dark eyes look almost amber. Charles felt his heart begin to race, the steady rhythm he'd maintained during their walk suddenly becoming erratic and wild. This was it, the moment he had been both hoping for and terrifying himself with for the better part of 6 months. He could see the determination in Stephen's eyes, mixed with something that looked like fear and hope and desperate courage rolled into one. "Quote fire," Charles began, but Stephen held up a hand to stop him. "Quote I," Stephen said, his voice shaking slightly. "Quote 6. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Because what Stephen was about to say would either change everything between them or destroy the friendship that had become the most important thing in Charles's life. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, standing in the soft glow of a streetlight, with the weight of unspoken words hanging between them, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Charles had been convinced that his feelings for Stephen were nothing more than a phase, a confusion brought on by the loneliness that had settled over him after his last relationship ended badly. He had been dating women exclusively for his entire adult life, had never questioned his sexuality, had never felt anything more than platonic friendship for another man. Until Stephen moved into the apartment across the hall. The breakup with Marie Morgan had been particularly brutal, not because they had been deeply in love, but because it had forced Charles to confront the fact that he'd never been deeply in love with anyone. Marie had accused him of being emotionally unavailable, of going through the motions without ever really being present in their relationship. The worst part was that she'd been right. Charles had cared about Marie, had enjoyed her company, had even thought he might love her. But there had always been something missing, some essential spark that would have made it feel real and worth fighting for. "You're a good man, Charles," Marie had said during their final conversation, her voice raw but not angry. "But you're not my man, and I don't think I'm your woman. I think we've both been settling, and we both deserve better than that." Her words had haunted him for weeks afterward. Was he really that emotionally unavailable? Was there something fundamentally wrong with him that prevented him from forming deep connections? He'd thrown himself into work, spending long hours at the marketing firm and coming home to an empty apartment that felt more like a way station than a home. Stephen had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March with nothing but 2 suitcases and a guitar case, looking lost and slightly overwhelmed. Charles had been leaving for work when he noticed the new neighbor struggling with his key in the lock, muttering Spanish curses under his breath that somehow managed to sound musical even in frustration. Something about the sight of this beautiful, frustrated man had made Charles stop and offer help. Maybe it was the way Stephen's shoulders were set with determination, despite his obvious exhaustion, or the way he kept pushing his dark hair back from his face with increasing irritation. Whatever it was, Charles had felt compelled to approach. "New place?" Charles had asked, approaching with what he hoped was a friendly smile. Stephen had looked up, and Charles had felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves to accommodate this new reality. Stephen's eyes were the darkest brown he had ever seen, framed by thick lashes that most women would kill for. His black hair was slightly mussed from sleep or travel, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that made Charles want to protect him from whatever had put that lost look in his eyes. Quatro 10. Stephen had replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that Charles would later learn came from growing up in a bilingual household in Texas. Quote 11. There had been something in the way Stephen said, quote 12, going, that suggested he wasn't entirely sure this place qualified for that designation yet. Charles had recognized the feeling from his own experience of moving to the city 5 years earlier. That sense of being unmoored and trying to convince yourself that geography could solve whatever was missing from your life. Charles had helped him with the stubborn lock, their hands brushing briefly when Stephen took the keys back. The contact had lasted maybe 2 seconds, but Charles had felt it like an electric shock, a jolt of awareness that traveled up his arm and lodged somewhere in his chest. He had dismissed it then as simple human connection, the kind of spark that could happen between any two people meeting for the first time. He had been wrong. "I'm Charles, by the way," he had said, stepping back to give Stephen space to open his door. "I live right across the hall, so if you need anything while you're getting settled." Stephen had replied, finally managing to get his key to turn. "Stephen Mendoza, and thank you, that's really kind of you to offer." There had been a moment of awkward silence as they both tried to figure out how to end the interaction. Charles had been acutely aware of the time, knowing he needed to leave for work, but reluctant to walk away from this intriguing new neighbor. "Well," Charles had said finally, "welcome to the building. I hope you like it here." "I'm sure I will," Stephen had replied. And when he smiled, Charles had felt that strange shift in his chest again, stronger this time. Over the following weeks, they had fallen into an easy friendship that felt as natural as breathing. Stephen worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant he was home during the day when Charles returned from his job at the marketing firm downtown. They began sharing coffee in the mornings, Stephen appearing at Charles's door with 2 steaming mugs and that slightly shy smile that never failed to make Charles's stomach flutter in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. Quote 20. Stephen had said the first morning he had knocked on Charles's door, holding 2 mismatched mugs and looking slightly uncertain. Quote 21, quote 22. Charles had replied, stepping aside to let Stephen in. Quote 3. It had become a ritual after that, one that Charles looked forward to more than he cared to admit. Stephen would arrive at 7:30 sharp, usually wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt that somehow managed to look effortlessly stylish on him. They would sit on Charles's small balcony when the weather was nice, or at his kitchen table when it wasn't, talking about everything and nothing while the city woke up around them. Stephen was funny in a quiet way. making observations about their neighbors and the city that caught Charles off guard and made him laugh until his sides hurt. He had a gift for finding humor in everyday situations, pointing out the absurdities of urban life with a gentle wit that never felt mean-spirited. Quote 24. Stephen had asked one day, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Quote 25. Charles had laughed, nearly choking on his coffee. Quote 27. Quote 20. Stephen was also incredibly kind, the sort of person who remembered that Charles preferred his coffee black and always asked about his day with genuine interest. He had a way of listening that made Charles feel heard in a way he'd never experienced before, giving his full attention to whatever Charles was saying, no matter how trivial it might seem. Most importantly, Stephen was easy to talk to in a way that Charles had never experienced with anyone else. Conversations flowed between them naturally, moving from light topics to deeper discussions without any awkwardness. Charles found himself sharing things with Stephen that he'd never told anyone, opening up about his work frustrations, his family dynamics, his hopes and fears for the future. It was during one of these morning coffee sessions, about a month after Stephen had moved in, that Charles first realized his feelings might be more complicated than simple friendship. They had been sitting on Charles's small balcony, watching the city wake up below them, when Stephen had mentioned his ex-girlfriend. Sarah Torres, Stephen had said, staring into his coffee cup with an expression Charles couldn't quite read. Quote 29. Charles had felt a strange twist in his stomach at the mention of Stephen's ex-girlfriend, something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. The emotion had caught him off guard, sharp and unexpected and completely inappropriate. He had pushed the feeling down, focusing instead on the pain in Stephen's voice. Charles had asked, trying to keep his tone neutral and supportive. Quote 31. Stephen had looked up then, meeting Charles's eyes directly. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Like you were going through the motions of being the person you thought you were supposed to be, instead of figuring out who you actually are? The question had hit Charles like a physical blow, resonating with something deep inside him that he'd been trying to ignore for years. Because yes, he had felt exactly that way, especially in his last relationship with Marie Morgan. He had gone through all the right motions, said all the right things, checked all the boxes that society told him were important for a successful relationship. But something had always been missing, some essential spark that would have made it feel real and right and worth fighting for. Charles had admitted, his voice quieter than he'd intended. I think I know exactly what you mean. Stephen had nodded, a look of understanding passing between them that felt significant in a way Charles couldn't quite name. It was as if Stephen had given voice to something Charles had been feeling but couldn't articulate, a sense of disconnection from his own life that he'd attributed to everything except the truth. That conversation had planted a seed of something in Charles's mind, something he wasn't ready to name or examine. But it had grown anyway, fed by every shared laugh, every casual touch, every moment when Stephen looked at him like he was the most interesting person in the world. The realization that he was falling in love with Stephen had hit Charles on a Thursday evening in late April. They had been cooking dinner together in Charles's kitchen, something that had become a regular occurrence over the past few weeks. Stephen was an excellent cook, having learned from his grandmother, who had immigrated from Mexico and brought her family recipes with her. Charles, on the other hand, was hopeless at anything more complicated than pasta and takeout, so it worked out well for both of them. The kitchen had been filled with the warm, spicy scents of Stephen's cooking, and Charles had been content to watch and learn, occasionally chopping vegetables or stirring something when instructed. It was domestic in a way that Charles had never experienced before, comfortable and intimate without being sexual. They moved around each other easily in the small space, Stephen reaching around Charles to grab spices from the cabinet, Charles handing Stephen ingredients without being asked. Stephen had been standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled incredible, when he had started telling Charles about a project he was working on. It was a logo design for a local nonprofit that worked with homeless youth, and Stephen's passion for the cause had been evident in every word. The thing is, Stephen had said, his hands gesturing expressively as he talked, these kids have been invisible for so long, you know. Society looks right through them, pretends they don't exist. So the logo needs to be something that makes people stop and really see them, something that demands attention in the best possible way. His face had been animated, his eyes bright with enthusiasm, and Charles had found himself completely mesmerized. Not by the story, though that was compelling in its own right, but by the way Stephen's eyes lit up when he was passionate about something, by the way his accent became more pronounced when he was excited, by the way he unconsciously moved closer to Charles when he wanted to emphasize a point. Quote 37. Stephen had continued, pulling out his phone to show Charles some preliminary designs. Quote 38. Charles had looked at the sketches, genuinely impressed by Stephen's talent and vision. But more than that, he had been struck by the compassion in Stephen's voice, the way he talked about these young people he'd never met as if their struggles were personal to him. It was in that moment, watching Stephen cook and talk and simply exist in his space, that Charles had understood with crystal clarity that what he was feeling went far beyond friendship. He was in love with Stephen Mendoza, completely and utterly and hopelessly in love with everything about him. The way he moved through the world with such kindness and creativity, the way he made Charles feel like the best version of himself, the way his presence had transformed Charles's apartment from a place to sleep into something that actually felt like home. The realization had been terrifying. Charles had never questioned his sexuality before, had never felt anything like this for another man. He'd had crushes on male celebrities when he was younger, but he'd dismissed those as normal admiration, the kind of thing every straight guy experienced. This was different, deeper, and more complex, and absolutely undeniable. But there was no denying what he felt when he looked at Stephen, no explaining away the way his heart raced when Stephen smiled at him or the way his entire day improved just from seeing Stephen's face. This wasn't admiration or friendship or confusion. This was love, pure and simple, and completely unexpected. Charles had spent the rest of that evening in a state of quiet panic, trying to act normal while his world rearranged itself around this new understanding of who he was and what he wanted. Stephen thankfully had been too focused on his cooking to notice Charles's internal crisis, chattering happily about his work and asking Charles about his day at the office. "You're quiet tonight," Stephen had observed as they sat down to eat the incredible meal he'd prepared. "Quote 42, quote 42, and Charles had lied, forcing a smile, quote 42. Stephen had accepted the explanation without question, launching into a story about a difficult client that had Charles laughing despite his emotional turmoil. It was one of the things Charles loved about Stephen, his ability to read the room and provide exactly what was needed, whether that was conversation or comfortable silence. That night, alone in his apartment, after Stephen had gone home, Charles had allowed himself to really think about what this meant. He was attracted to Stephen, yes, but it was more than that. He craved Stephen's company in a way that went beyond friendship. He found himself thinking about what it would be like to hold Stephen's hand, to kiss him, to wake up next to him. The thoughts should have almost scared him more than they did. Instead, Charles had felt something like relief. All those relationships with women that had felt like he was going through the motions suddenly made sense. He hadn't been broken or incapable of love. He had just been looking in the wrong direction. The emotional unavailability that Marie had accused him of hadn't been a character flaw. It had been the natural result of trying to force feelings that simply weren't there. But understanding his feelings and acting on them were two very different things. Stephen had just gotten out of a serious relationship with a woman. He had never given any indication that he was interested in men, let alone in Charles specifically. And Charles valued their friendship too much to risk destroying it by confessing feelings that might not be reciprocated. The thought of losing Stephen's friendship was unbearable. These morning coffee sessions, these easy conversations, this comfortable companionship, it had become the best part of Charles's day, the thing he looked forward to most. If he confessed his feelings and Stephen was horrified or uncomfortable, Charles would lose not just his chance at love, but his best friend as well. So Charles had decided to keep his feelings to himself, to be content with Stephen's friendship and try not to want more than Stephen was willing to give. It had seemed like a reasonable plan at the time, a mature way to handle an impossible situation. The plan had lasted exactly 2 weeks. The night everything changed had started innocuously enough. It was a Friday in early May, and Charles had been planning to spend the evening alone, catching up on work emails, and maybe watching a movie on Netflix. He'd been looking forward to a quiet night, a chance to decompress from a particularly stressful week at the office. But Stephen had knocked on his door around 8 o'clock, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that Charles had learned to recognize as Stephen's "I need to talk" face. There was a tightness around his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that immediately put Charles on alert. "Are you busy?" Stephen had asked, shifting the wine bottle from one hand to the other. "I could use some company tonight if you don't mind." Charles had stepped aside to let him in without hesitation, noting the tension in Stephen's shoulders and the way he was gripping the wine bottle a little too tightly. Whatever was bothering Stephen, it was serious. Code 40 says. Charles had asked, taking the wine bottle and heading toward the kitchen to find glasses. Code 47. Stephen had corrected, settling onto Charles's couch with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Sarah called. She wants to talk about getting back together." Charles had felt his stomach drop, the wine glasses suddenly feeling slippery in his hands. He had managed to pour them both generous servings without dropping anything, but his hands had been shaking slightly as he carried the glasses back to the living room. "How do you feel about that?" Charles had asked, settling on the opposite end of the couch and trying to keep his expression neutral. Stephen had taken a long sip of wine before answering, staring at the glass as if it might contain the answers he was looking for. "Confused," he had finally admitted. "Part of me thinks it would be the easy thing to do. We had a good thing for a while, and she's a wonderful person. Maybe I was just being selfish, wanting something more than what we had. And the other part of you? The other part of me knows that going back would be settling, that I'd be choosing the safe option instead of figuring out what I really want." Stephen had looked up then, meeting Charles's eyes. At 54. Charles had felt his chest tighten with something that might have been panic. The thought of Stephen getting back together with Sarah Torres was almost unbearable, but he couldn't exactly say that without revealing feelings he wasn't ready to share. Quote 55. Charles had asked, proud of how steady his voice sounded. Quote 56. Stephen had taken another sip of wine, then set his glass down and ran his hands through his hair. They had talked for hours that night, working their way through the bottle of wine as Stephen wrestled with his feelings about his ex-girlfriend and his uncertainty about the future. Charles had listened and offered what support he could, all while trying to ignore the way his heart broke a little more with each mention of Sarah Torres. Stephen had talked about the pressure he'd felt to settle down, to follow the traditional path that his family expected. He'd talked about the guilt he felt for breaking Sarah's heart, for not being able to love her the way she deserved. Most painfully, he'd talked about the loneliness he'd felt even when they were together, the sense that he was performing a role rather than being himself. "I keep thinking about what you said that morning on your balcony," Stephen had said, his voice soft and slightly slurred from the wine, "about feeling like you're living someone else's life. I've been feeling that way for years, Charles. Even before Sarah, even back in college. Like I was following a script that someone else wrote for me." "What would your script look like?" Charles had asked, genuinely curious despite the pain in his chest. Stephen had been quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "I don't know," he had finally admitted. "That's the problem. I've been so focused on being what other people expected that I'm not sure I know who I really am anymore." It was past midnight when Stephen had finally gotten to the heart of what was bothering him. "Charles," he had said, his voice soft and slightly slurred from the wine, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." Stephen had shifted on the couch, moving closer without seeming to realize it. The movement had brought him close enough that Charles could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Have you ever been attracted to a man?" The question had caught Charles completely off guard. He had nearly choked on his wine, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to answer. The truth was right there on the tip of his tongue, dangerous and terrifying and absolutely honest. But he couldn't bring himself to say it, not when Stephen was vulnerable and confused, impossibly about to get back together with his ex-girlfriend. Quote 67. Stephen had shifted again, close enough now that their knees were almost touching. Quote 68. Charles's heart had started racing, hope and terror warring in his chest. Have you been attracted to a man?" "Maybe," Stephen had whispered, his eyes fixed on Charles's face with an intensity that made Charles feel like he was being seen for the first time. Quote 71. Charles had stared at Stephen, hardly daring to breathe. The air between them felt charged with possibility, heavy with words that hadn't been spoken yet, but hung in the space between them like promises waiting to be made. "Who is it?" Charles had managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Stephen had looked directly at him then, his dark eyes intense and vulnerable, and full of something that might have been hope. "I think you know." The moment had stretched between them, heavy with possibility and terror, and the weight of everything that was about to change. Charles had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall, and he wasn't sure which outcome scared him more. But before he could find the courage to respond, before he could reach across the space between them and take Stephen's hand, Stephen's phone had buzzed with a text message, breaking the spell that had been weaving itself around them. Stephen had glanced at his phone and sighed, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. The moment had passed, and Charles had felt it slip away like sand through his fingers. All the courage he had been building, all the hope that had been growing in his chest, deflated like a balloon losing air. Stephen had finished his wine and gone home shortly after, leaving Charles alone with the echo of his words and the weight of what might have been a confession. Charles had spent the rest of the night replaying the conversation, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning. Had Stephen been talking about him? The description certainly seemed to fit, but Charles couldn't be sure. And even if Stephen had been talking about him, what did that mean when Stephen was considering getting back together with Sarah? The next few weeks had been torture for Charles. Stephen had met with Sarah Torres, and while he hadn't gotten back together with her, he had seemed more confused than ever about what he wanted. The easy intimacy they had shared during their wine-fueled conversation had disappeared, replaced by a careful politeness that made Charles feel like he was losing his best friend along with any chance of something more. Stephen had become distant, still friendly but reserved in a way that made Charles's chest ache with loss. Their morning coffee sessions became sporadic, Stephen claiming he was busy with work or had errands to run. When they did spend time together, there was a careful distance between them, as if Stephen was afraid of getting too close. Charles had thrown himself into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. He had avoided the coffee sessions that had become such an important part of his routine, partly to give Stephen space, and partly because he couldn't bear the awkwardness that had settled between them like a wall. The marketing firm where Charles worked had been going through a particularly busy period, with several major campaigns launching simultaneously. Charles had welcomed the distraction, throwing himself into strategy meetings and client presentations with an intensity that his colleagues noticed. Quote 75. His colleague Janet had observed one afternoon, finding Charles still at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. Quote 76. Quote 7. Charles had replied, not looking up from his computer screen. Janet had studied him for a moment, her expression concerned. Quote 78. Charles had tried to remember the last time he genuinely enjoyed himself, and had realized with a start that it had been that night with Stephen, before everything had gotten complicated. "I'll take some time off soon," he had promised, knowing it was a lie even as he said it. But work could only distract him for so long. Every evening when he came home, he was reminded of what he was missing. He would see Stephen's closed door across the hall and feel a pang of loss so sharp it took his breath away. The silence from Stephen's apartment felt deafening, a constant reminder of the friendship that was slipping away. Charles had tried to convince himself that this distance was for the best. If Stephen was questioning his sexuality, if he was dealing with feelings he didn't understand, then maybe Charles's presence was only making things more complicated. Maybe the kindest thing he could do was step back and let Stephen figure things out without the added pressure of their friendship. But the logic didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. Charles had gotten used to having Stephen in his life, had come to depend on their conversations and shared meals in easy companionship. Without that, his apartment felt empty and his days felt hollow. It was Stephen who had finally broken the stalemate. He had shown up at Charles's door on a Wednesday evening in late May, looking frustrated and determined and more like his old self than he had in weeks. "We need to talk," Stephen had said without preamble, pushing past Charles into the apartment. "You've been avoiding me for 2 weeks, and I want to know why." Charles had closed the door and turned to face Stephen, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Stephen was standing in the middle of the living room, his hands clenched at his sides and his jaw set with determination. "I haven't been avoiding you," Charles had said, knowing it was a lie even as the words left his mouth. "Bullshit," Stephen had replied, and Charles had been surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "Ever since that night when we talked about Sarah, you've been different, distant. You've been leaving for work earlier, coming home later, and when I do see you, you act like you can barely stand to be in the same room with me. Did I say something wrong? Did I make you uncomfortable?" Charles had looked at Stephen, really looked at him, and had seen the hurt and confusion in his eyes. Stephen was suffering too, and Charles realized that his attempt to give Stephen space had only made things worse for both of them. "No," Charles had said finally, his voice soft with regret. "You didn't say anything wrong. I thought you needed time to figure things out with Sarah." "There's nothing to figure out with Sarah," Stephen had said firmly, moving closer. "I told her I couldn't get back together with her. That chapter of my life is closed, Charles. It has been for months." Charles had felt a flutter of hope, quickly followed by confusion. "Then why have you been so distant?" Stephen had run his hands through his hair, a gesture Charles recognized as a sign of frustration. "Because I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation, how to tell you something that might change everything between us, and I wasn't sure if you were ready to hear it." "What conversation?" Stephen had moved closer still, close enough that Charles could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "The conversation about what I meant that night when I told you about someone in my life who makes me feel like myself. The conversation about why I really broke up with Sarah. The conversation about why I can't stop thinking about you." Charles had felt his breath catch. This was it, the moment he had been both longing for and dreading. "Stephen, that night when I asked you about being attracted to men, you never answered me," Stephen had continued, his voice gaining strength. "But I saw the look in your eyes. I saw recognition there, and something that looked like fear. And I've been wondering ever since if maybe, just maybe, you feel the same way about me that I feel about you." Charles had closed his eyes, trying to find the courage to be honest. When he opened them again, Stephen was watching him with an intensity that made his skin feel like it was on fire. "Yes," Charles had whispered. "I have been attracted to a man. Just one. Just one." Stephen had reached out then, his fingers brushing against Charles's hand. The contact had sent electricity shooting up Charles's arm, just like that first day when Stephen had taken his keys back. But stronger now, more intense and meaningful. "Is it me?" Stephen had asked, his voice barely audible. Charles had looked down at their hands, Stephen's fingers now intertwined with his own. The simple contact felt monumental, like crossing a bridge he'd been afraid to approach for months. "Yes," Charles had admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "It's you. It's always been you." The confession had hung in the air between them, changing everything. Stephen had squeezed Charles's hand, and when Charles had looked up, he had seen relief and something that might have been joy in Stephen's expression. "I was hoping you'd say that," Stephen had admitted, his free hand coming up to cup Charles's cheek. Quote 100 Farn. The kiss that followed had been inevitable, like gravity pulling them together after months of orbiting around each other. Stephen had cupped Charles's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across Charles's cheekbones as he leaned in slowly, giving Charles every opportunity to pull away. But Charles didn't want to pull away. He had been dreaming of this moment for months, imagining what it would feel like to finally close the distance between them. When their lips met, it was soft at first, tentative and questioning, a gentle exploration that sent shivers down Charles's spine. The kiss deepened gradually, becoming more urgent and desperate as months of suppressed longing finally found expression. Charles had never been kissed like that before, with such tenderness and passion combined. Every nerve ending in his body had come alive, and he had understood in that moment why all his previous relationships had felt like he was going through the motions. This was what he had been missing, this connection that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff at the same time. Stephen's hands had moved to tangle in Charles's hair, and Charles had found himself pressing closer, his arms wrapping around Stephen's waist to pull him in. They fit together perfectly, like puzzle pieces that had finally found their proper places. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Stephen had rested his forehead against Charles's, their bodies still pressed close together. Quote 105. Stephen had whispered, his breath warm against Charles's skin. Yeah, Charles had agreed, his voice shaky with emotion. Wow. They had stood there for a long moment, just holding each other and trying to process what had just happened. Charles had felt like his entire world had shifted on its axis, like everything that had come before this moment had been leading up to this single, perfect kiss. I can't believe we just did that, Stephen had said. But he was smiling, his eyes bright with happiness and something that looked like wonder. I can't believe we waited so long to do that, Charles had replied, making Stephen laugh. They had spent the rest of that evening talking, really talking, about their feelings and their fears and what this all meant. They had moved to the couch, sitting close together with their hands intertwined, neither of them wanting to break the physical connection that felt so new and precious. Stephen had admitted that he had been questioning his sexuality for months, that his attraction to Charles had been the catalyst for his breakup with Sarah Torres. I kept telling myself it was just friendship, he had said, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of Charles's hand. Quote, Charles had confessed how long he had been in love with Stephen, how every day of trying to hide his feelings had been its own special kind of torture. Quote 112, he had said, echoing Stephen's words. But deep down, I think I knew. I was just too scared to admit it. What were you scared of? Stephen had asked, his voice gentle. Losing you, Charles had replied honestly. Your friendship means everything to me, and I couldn't bear the thought of ruining that by wanting more than you were willing to give. I was scared too, Stephen had replied, bringing their joined hands up to press a kiss to Charles's knuckles. Kotarnim. They had talked about their families, about coming out, about what this meant for their futures. Stephen had admitted that he had never been with a man before, that Charles would be his first in every sense of the word. Charles had shared his own inexperience, his fear that he wouldn't know how to be a good boyfriend to another man. We'll figure it out together, Stephen had said, his voice full of quiet confidence. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to be honest with each other and take it one day at a time. That night had been the beginning of something beautiful and terrifying and absolutely right. They had taken things slowly, both of them navigating new territory and trying to figure out how to be together in a way that honored both their feelings and their friendship. The physical intimacy had developed gradually, each touch and kiss a revelation. Charles had discovered that Stephen was affectionate in a way that made his heart ache with happiness, always reaching for his hand or curling up against his side when they watched movies. Stephen had learned that Charles expressed love through small gestures, bringing him coffee in the morning and remembering every little thing that mattered to him. Their first real date had been a week after that first kiss, dinner at a small Italian restaurant that Stephen had discovered during his walks around the neighborhood. They had been nervous, both of them hyper-aware that this was different from their usual casual meals together. But the nervousness had faded quickly, replaced by the same easy conversation and comfortable companionship that had characterized their friendship. This is nice, Stephen had said, reaching across the table to take Charles's hand. Charles had asked, intertwining their fingers. Quote 124. Stephen had replied with a smile that made Charles's heart skip a beat. But it hadn't all been easy. There had been moments of doubt and fear, times when the magnitude of what they were doing had felt overwhelming. Charles had worried that he wasn't experienced enough, that he wouldn't know how to navigate a relationship with another man. Stephen had struggled with internalized expectations, with the voice in his head that told him this wasn't what he was supposed to want. Sometimes I feel like I'm being selfish, Stephen had confessed one night as they laid in bed together, Charles's head on his chest. Chitip 7. Charles had asked, lifting his head to look at Stephen. Stephen had been quiet for a moment, his fingers running through Charles's hair. No, he had finally said. It's different, and it's scary sometimes, but it's not harder. It feels right in a way that nothing else ever has. The first real test of their relationship had come 2 months after that first kiss. Stephen's parents had announced they were coming to visit, and Stephen had been a nervous wreck for, for weeks leading up to their arrival. His family was traditional, Catholic, and deeply rooted in their Mexican heritage. While they had always been loving and supportive, Stephen had never given them any reason to think he might be anything other than straight. Quote 30 min. Stephen had confessed to Charles the night before his parents arrived. They had been lying in bed together, Stephen's head on Charles's shoulder, his body tense with anxiety. Quote 131. Charles had held him close, feeling Stephen's anxiety like a physical weight between them. "You don't have to tell them anything you're not ready to share," he had said, his fingers stroking Stephen's hair in what he hoped was a soothing gesture. "What 133, quoting 134, Stephen had whispered, his voice muffled against Charles's chest. "I just need time. I need to figure out how to have that conversation without breaking their hearts." Charles had understood, had tried to be supportive, even as it broke his heart to think about pretending they were just friends. He had experienced his own struggles with coming out to his family, though his parents had been surprisingly accepting when he had finally worked up the courage to tell them about Stephen. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something," Charles had said during a video call a few weeks earlier. "I'm seeing someone. His name is Stephen, and I'm in love with him." There had been a moment of silence, his parents processing this unexpected revelation. Then his mother had smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" she had asked. "Happier than I've ever been," Charles had replied honestly. "Then we're happy for you," his father had added. "We'd love to meet him sometime." But Stephen's family was different, more traditional in their values and expectations. Stephen had grown up hearing subtle but consistent messages about what constituted a proper relationship, a proper life. The thought of disappointing them, of potentially losing their love and support, was terrifying. For 3 days, they had maintained the fiction that they were simply neighbors who had become close friends. Charles had stayed in his own apartment, had limited his interactions with Stephen to casual hallway conversations and polite hellos when Stephen's parents were around. It had been excruciating. After months of growing closer, of learning to express their love freely, the sudden return to hiding had felt like a step backward. Charles had found himself questioning whether Stephen was truly ready for a relationship with him, whether he would always be something Stephen felt he needed to hide. Stephen's parents were lovely people, warm and welcoming, in the way that made Charles understand where Stephen had gotten his kindness and generosity. His mother, Elena, was a small woman with Stephen's same dark eyes and expressive hands. His father, Roberto, was quieter but no less warm, with a gentle smile and an obvious pride in his son's accomplishments. Quote 142. Elena had said to Charles during one of their brief interactions in the hallway, quote on 143, quote this 144. Charles had replied, the words feeling inadequate and somehow dishonest. The breaking point had come on the third day of his parents' visit. Charles had been coming home from work when he had run into Stephen and his mother in the hallway. They had been discussing dinner plans, Elena suggesting they go to a nice restaurant to celebrate Roberto's birthday. Elena had said, turning to smile at him, quote one Jim. Stephen had introduced him as, quote Jim, and something about the careful neutrality in Stephen's voice, the way he had stepped slightly away from Charles as he spoke, had cut Charles deeper than he had expected. It wasn't just the words, but the distance in Stephen's eyes, the way he had looked at Charles like he was exactly what he claimed to be. Just a neighbor, just a friend. "That's very kind of you to offer," Charles had said, forcing a smile. "But I wouldn't want to intrude on family time." "Nonsense," Elena had insisted. "Stephen, tell him he must join us." But Stephen had hesitated just a moment too long, and Charles had seen something flicker in his eyes that looked like relief. "Charles is probably busy," Stephen had said finally. "Maybe another time." Charles had excused himself and gone into his apartment, closing the door and leaning against it as the full weight of the situation hit him. He was Stephen's secret, something to be hidden away when the real world intruded. The realization had been devastating, not because he didn't understand Stephen's position, but because it forced him to confront the possibility that this might always be their reality. That evening, after Stephen's parents had gone to bed, Stephen had knocked on Charles's door. He had looked exhausted and miserable, his usually bright eyes dull with pain and guilt. Stephen had said without preamble, pushing into the apartment and closing the door behind him. "Wait, empty 5." Charles had felt his heart skip at Stephen's words, hope and fear warring in his chest. Stephen? No, let me finish. Stephen had moved closer, his hands reaching out to frame Charles's face. Quote 158. Charles had felt a surge of love and pride so intense it had taken his breath away. Quote 159. Quote to 160 where Stephen had replied, his voice strong and certain. Quoted 161. They had held each other then. Charles, feeling like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying, had been lifted from his shoulders. This was the Stephen he had fallen in love with, brave and honest and willing to fight for what mattered to him. The conversation with Stephen's parents the next morning had been difficult but ultimately successful. Stephen had been nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he asked his parents to sit down for an important conversation. Quote was 60 Brian, he had begun, his voice steady despite his obvious anxiety. Quote was 63. He had told them about his relationship with Charles, about how they had fallen in love, about how happy Charles made him. Elena had cried, not from disappointment, but from the obvious emotion in her son's voice as he talked about his love for Charles. Roberto had been quiet for a long time, processing this new information about his son. Are you happy, mijo? Elena had finally asked, the same question Charles's mother had asked. Quote 100 Sikarim, quote while she had said, pulling Stephen into a fierce hug. Quote 167. Roberto had been slower to come around, but by the end of their visit, he had pulled Charles aside for a private conversation. Quote 168 he had said, his English careful but clear. Quote 169, quote 170 Charles had promised. Quote 171 or quote 172. Roberto had replied with a small smile. Quote 173. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been a beginning. Stephen's parents had left with promises to call more often and invitations for Charles to visit them in Texas. Most importantly, they had left with a clear understanding of how much their son loved Charles and how much Charles loved him in return. The months that followed had been some of the happiest of Charles's life. He and Stephen had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural and right, spending most nights together and slowly merging their lives in small but significant ways. Stephen's clothes had started appearing in Charles's closet, Charles's books had found their way onto Stephen's shelves, and somehow Charles's apartment had become their apartment without any formal discussion. The transition had been gradual and organic, driven by practical considerations as much as emotional ones. Stephen's apartment was smaller and less comfortable, with a kitchen that barely qualified for the name and a bathroom that had seen better days. Charles's place was larger and brighter, with better amenities and more space for both of them to work. Stephen had observed one morning, looking around Charles's bedroom, where his clothes were draped over a chair and his toiletries had taken up residence on the bathroom counter. Is that a problem? Charles had asked, suddenly worried that Stephen felt pressured or overwhelmed by how quickly their lives were blending together. No, Stephen had said, with a smile that made Charles's heart flutter. They had navigated the challenges of being a new couple with patience and humor, learning each other's quirks and boundaries. Charles had discovered that Stephen was a morning person who liked to talk through problems out loud, while Stephen had learned that Charles needed quiet time to process his emotions and that he expressed love through actions rather than words. The physical side of their relationship had evolved naturally, each milestone feeling like a celebration of their growing intimacy. Charles had never experienced the kind of passion he felt with Stephen, the way every touch could set his entire body on fire. But more than that, he had never felt so safe with another person, so completely accepted and understood. Their first time making love had been tender and awkward and absolutely perfect. They had taken their time, exploring each other with gentle hands and whispered endearments, learning what brought pleasure and what felt good. There had been nervous laughter and moments of uncertainty, but underneath it all had been a deep sense of rightness, of coming home to themselves and each other. I love you, Stephen had whispered afterward, his head on Charles's chest as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of their lovemaking. Quote 179. Charles had replied, his fingers tracing patterns on Stephen's bare shoulder. So much it scares me sometimes. Good scared or bad scared? Stephen had asked, lifting his head to look at Charles. Good scared, Charles had said, leaning down to kiss him softly. The kind of scared that means something matters. It was during this period of contentment that Charles had begun to understand what Stephen had meant about feeling like he had been living someone else's life. For the first time, Charles felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the right person. The restlessness that had plagued him in previous relationships had disappeared, replaced by a deep sense of peace and belonging. But even in the midst of their happiness, Charles sometimes found himself waiting for the other shoe to drop. He had never been in a relationship that felt this right, this easy, and part of him couldn't quite believe it was real. Stephen, with his intuitive understanding of Charles's insecurities, had been patient with these moments of doubt, always ready with reassurance and affection. Quote 184, Stephen had said one evening as they lay in bed together, Charles's head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. We don't have to pretend with each other. I can be exactly who I am, and you love me anyway. I don't love you anyway, Charles had corrected, lifting his head to look at Stephen with fierce intensity. I love you because of who you are. All of it. Your kindness, your creativity, your terrible jokes, the way you sing in the shower when you think I can't hear you. I love all of it. Stephen had laughed, his eyes bright with tears. I don't have terrible jokes. You have terrible jokes, Charles had insisted, making Stephen laugh harder. It was conversations like these that had slowly eroded Charles's fears and insecurities, replacing them with a confidence he had never felt before. Stephen loved him, all of him, and that love was transforming Charles in ways he was still discovering. They had established routines that felt precious and domestic, Sunday morning pancakes that Stephen made from scratch, while Charles read the news aloud from his tablet. Evening walks through the neighborhood holding hands and talking about their days. Lazy Saturday afternoons spent on the couch, Stephen working on design projects while Charles read, their feet tangled together in comfortable intimacy. Quote 190. Stephen had said one Saturday afternoon, gesturing around their shared space. Quote 21, quote none, Charles had asked, looking up from his book. Quote Wyram, Stephen had replied, making Charles's heart skip with the simple truth of it. The evening that had led to their walk in the rain had started like any other. They had been planning to cook dinner together and spend a quiet night at home, maybe watch a movie, or work on their respective projects. It was a Thursday in late July, and the summer heat had been oppressive all week, making their air-conditioned apartment feel like a sanctuary. But Stephen had seemed distracted and restless all day, checking his phone more frequently than usual and starting conversations only to trail off mid-sentence. Charles had noticed but hadn't pushed, knowing that Stephen would talk when he was ready. They had developed a comfortable understanding of each other's communication styles, and Charles had learned that Stephen needed time to process big emotions before he could articulate them. It was while they were preparing dinner, Stephen's grandmother's recipe for chicken enchiladas that had become one of Charles's favorites, that Stephen had finally opened up about what was bothering him. Quote one term then. Stephen had said suddenly, his hands stilling on the vegetables he was chopping. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, changing the entire atmosphere of their peaceful evening. Charles had felt his stomach clench with sudden anxiety, a cold dread spreading through his chest. He had managed to say, though his voice sounded strange and forced even to his own ears. Quote 196. Quote 197. The single word had hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and dangerous, incapable of cutting through everything they had built together. Portland was 3,000 miles away, a different coast, a different life entirely. Charles had felt the bottom drop out of his world, but he had tried to keep his voice steady when he responded. Quote 198. Stephen had set down his knife and turned to face Charles fully, his expression a mixture of excitement and anguish. Quote man, he had shaken his head in disbelief. Charles had said, and he had meant it, even as his heart was breaking. Quote Turner, and Stephen had replied, his voice soft and conflicted. Quote Dwasht, Stephen had said simply. Quote 27. Charles had felt a complex mix of emotions at Stephen's words. Love and gratitude that Stephen would consider turning down his dream job for their relationship, but also fear that Stephen might come to resent him if he stayed. It was an impossible situation, and Charles had felt completely unprepared to handle it. "Stephen, you can't turn down your dream job for me," Charles had said, even as the words tore at his heart like claws. "That's not fair to either of us." "Why not? You're more important to me than any job." "But what if you regret it? What if you wake up in 5 years and resent me for being the reason you didn't take this chance?" Charles had moved closer, taking Stephen's hands in his own. Code 2 to 12. Stephen had pulled his hands free and run them through his hair, a gesture Charles recognized as a sign of deep frustration. Quote 233, they had talked in circles for hours, neither of them able to find a solution that felt right. Stephen had been torn between his professional ambitions and his love for Charles, while Charles had been terrified of both losing Stephen and being the reason Stephen gave up his dreams. Quote 200 from Charles had suggested at one point, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Quote Tutoam, quote Awashizi, Stephen had asked, his voice sharp with pain. The conversation had grown increasingly heated as they both struggled with the impossible choice in front of them. Charles had found himself saying things he didn't mean, pushing Stephen toward the job even as it killed him to do so. "You have to take it," Charles had said finally, his voice breaking. "You have to. This is your dream, Stephen. This is what you've been working toward your entire career. I can't be the reason you give that up. And I can't be the reason you're alone again," Stephen had replied, tears streaming down his face. "I can't be the person who comes into your life, makes you fall in love, and then leaves you behind for a job." It was during this conversation that the rain had started, a sudden downpour that matched the storm of emotions in Charles's chest. The sound of water hitting the windows had provided a soundtrack to their argument, and Stephen had looked out at the rain with something like desperation in his eyes. "Go to Tutu," he had said suddenly, his voice tight with frustration and confusion. Quote 223. Charles had wanted to say no, had wanted to protect himself from the pain of what felt like a prolonged goodbye, but he couldn't refuse Stephen anything, especially not when Stephen was hurting as much as he was. "Of course," Charles had said, grabbing his jacket. "Let's go." And that was how they had ended up walking through the rain-soaked streets, Stephen wrestling with an impossible decision, while Charles tried to figure out how to be supportive when his own heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Now, standing under the streetlight with Stephen's confession hanging in the air between them, Charles felt like they had come full circle. All the months of falling in love, of learning to trust each other, of building something beautiful together, had led to this moment. The rain had stopped, but Charles could still feel the dampness in the air, could still smell the clean scent of washed pavement and new beginnings. "Utpam," Stephen continued, his voice stronger now, filled with a certainty that hadn't been there during their earlier conversation. "Something I figured out while we were walking." Charles waited, hardly daring to breathe, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Stephen could hear it. "I called them back," Stephen said, his eyes never leaving Charles's face. "What again?" Charles felt his heart stop, then start again with a rhythm that felt entirely new. Quote, Stephen replied, stepping closer until they were almost touching, until Charles could see every fleck of gold in his dark eyes. Quote, Charles began, his voice weak with the effort of trying to be noble when all he wanted was to pull Stephen into his arms and never let him go. Quote, Stephen finished firmly. Quote, Charles felt tears prick at his eyes, emotions too big for his chest threatening to overwhelm him. Quote, Stephen reached out and cupped Charles's face in his hands, the same gesture he had made the night of their first kiss, but weighted now with months of shared history and deepened love. "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I love you. Charles Ruiz, I love the life we've built together, and I want to keep building it, here with you, for as long as you'll have me." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper and more certain, flavored with relief and joy, and the kind of love that changes everything. It tasted like rain and promises, and the future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, Charles felt like he could breathe properly for the first time all evening. "I love you too," he whispered against Stephen's lips, his hands fisting in Stephen's jacket to keep him close. "So much that it scares me sometimes. So much that I was willing to let you go if it meant you'd be happy." "I am happy," Stephen replied, resting his forehead against Charles's. Quote 242. They walked home hand in hand, no longer needing to maintain the careful distance they had kept earlier in the evening. The rain had stopped completely, and the world felt washed clean and full of possibility. Charles found himself thinking about the future in a way he never had before, imagining years of mornings with Stephen, of shared dreams and challenges overcome together. Quote 243. Charles asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Quote Twartum. Stephen smiled, squeezing Charles's hand. I told them that I was honored by the offer, but that I had found something more valuable than any job. I told them that I had found home, and I wasn't willing to leave it behind. And they understood? They said they were disappointed, but that they respected my decision. And then the hiring manager said something that made me know I'd made the right choice. What did she say? She said that anyone who knows what matters most to them and has the courage to choose it is exactly the kind of person they want to work with. She said if I ever change my mind, or if something opens up here locally, to give them a call. Charles felt a surge of admiration for Stephen's courage, for his willingness to choose love over ambition, to choose them over everything else. He said as they reached their door. Charles replied, pulling Stephen close for another kiss. Gotapa 254. 6 months later, Charles would look back on that rainy night as the moment everything truly began for them. Not their first kiss or their first confession of love, but the moment when Stephen had chosen their life together over everything else. It was the moment when Charles had finally understood that what they had was real and lasting and worth fighting for. The decision had proven to be the right one in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Stephen had eventually found another job opportunity that excited him just as much as the Portland position, but one that allowed him to stay in the city they now called home together. A local nonprofit had reached out after seeing his portfolio online, offering him a position that was perfectly suited to his skills and values. Quote 255. Stephen had said on his first day at the new job, practically glowing with excitement. Quote 256. Charles had been promoted at his own job as well, his dedication and creative thinking finally being recognized by the partners at the marketing firm. The promotion had come with a significant raise and more interesting projects, but more importantly, it had come with the validation that he was exactly where he was supposed to be professionally. They had moved into a larger apartment together, officially this time, combining their lives in ways that still made Charles's heart flutter with happiness. The new place was in a different part of the city, closer to both of their jobs, with more space and better light for Stephen's work. Stephen's guitar now sat in the corner of their living room next to Charles's bookshelf, a perfect metaphor for how seamlessly their lives had intertwined. The apartment had become a reflection of both of them, Charles's books and Stephen's art supplies, Charles's practical furniture and Stephen's colorful throws and plants. They had painted the walls together, argued good-naturedly about color choices, and created a space that felt uniquely theirs. But it was the small moments that Charles treasured most. The way Stephen still brought him coffee every morning, now prepared in their shared kitchen with the good coffee maker they had bought together. The way they had developed their own shorthand of looks and touches that communicated volumes without words. The way Stephen would curl up against his side when they watched movies. The way Charles would find little notes from Stephen in his work bag, reminders of love that carried him through difficult days. Charles had confessed one Sunday morning as they made pancakes together, Stephen humming while he cooked and Charles setting the table with their mismatched dishes. Stephen had asked, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. Quote Twitter 260. Charles had replied, making Stephen smile that brilliant smile that never failed to make Charles's heart skip. Charles had never imagined that love could feel like this, so easy and natural and right. He had spent years thinking he was broken somehow, incapable of the kind of deep connection he saw other people sharing. But Stephen had shown him that he hadn't been broken at all, just looking in the wrong direction. They had faced challenges, of course. Stephen's family had needed time to fully adjust to their relationship, though they had come to love Charles like a son. Charles's parents had embraced Stephen immediately, treating him like the family member they had always hoped Charles would find. There had been moments of doubt and insecurity, times when the weight of being in their first same-sex relationship had felt overwhelming. But they had worked through everything together, communicating openly and honestly about their fears and hopes. They had found a therapist who specialized in LGBTQ+ relationships, someone who helped them navigate the unique challenges they faced as a couple who had both come out later in life. What to 261. Their therapist had said during one of their sessions, quote 2262, now, as they lay in bed on a Sunday morning, 6 months after that rainy walk, Stephen's head on his chest and sunlight streaming through their bedroom window, Charles felt a contentment so profound it took his breath away. This was his life now, this beautiful, unexpected life with the man who had changed everything just by being exactly who he was. What are you thinking about? Stephen asked, his voice soft and sleepy, his breath warm against Charles's chest. 264. Charles replied, his fingers running through Stephen's dark hair, now longer than it had been when they first met. Us. How lucky I am to have found you. Stephen lifted his head to look at him, and Charles saw his own contentment reflected in those dark eyes he had fallen in love with. We both are, Stephen said, his voice full of quiet wonder. Lucky, I mean. To have found each other, to have had the courage to take the chance when it mattered most. Charles pulled Stephen up for a kiss, slow and sweet and full of promise. Outside their window, the city was waking up, but inside their bedroom, time felt suspended. They had all the time in the world, all the mornings and evenings and quiet moments they could want. I love you, Charles whispered against Stephen's lips, the words as true now as they had been the first time he'd said them. I love you too, Stephen replied, settling back against Charles's chest. Quote 270 down. And in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms with their whole future stretching out before them, Charles knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard. Sometimes the person you were meant to be with was standing right next to you all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach out and take their hand. They had taken that walk together on a rainy night, shoulder to shoulder, hearts heavy with the weight of impossible choices. But they had found their way through the storm and discovered that the most important destination wasn't a place at all. It was each other. And Charles knew with a certainty that went bone deep that they would keep walking together for the rest of their lives, whatever weather came their way. The rain had washed the world clean that night, and in its aftermath, they had found not just love, but home, not just passion, but peace, not just a relationship, but a partnership that would carry them through whatever challenges and joys the future might bring. As Stephen's breathing evened out and he drifted back towards sleep, Charles allowed himself to imagine all the mornings that lay ahead of them, all the conversations and discoveries, all the ordinary moments that would be made extraordinary by the simple fact that they would share them together. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for, this quiet happiness, this sense of being exactly where he belonged. And as he closed his eyes and let sleep claim him too, Charles smiled, knowing that the best part of their story was still being written, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time.